Welcome back to the Youth In podcast, the podcast where we discuss political ideology, policies, current day events, and more. I'm your host, Elia Amadi, and today's guest is Mr. Howie Hawkins, joined by my co-host, Alex Smith. Mr. Hawkins is the co-founder of the Green Party of the United States. He was the first U.S. candidate to support the Green New Deal during his run for governor of New York in 2010, and continued to be the party's candidate for governor of New York in 2014, where he received a historic 5% of the votes and was nominated again in 2018. Mr. Hawkins was a co-founder of the Anti-Nuclear Clamshell Alliance of 1976 and has fought for trade unions and eco-socialist policy his entire career. A staunch advocate for Medicare for All and the Green New Deal, Howie was the Green Party's nominee in the 2020 election. Mr. Hawkins, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mr. Hawkins, you're kind of would it be fair to say you're a self-identified eco-socialist? Would that be something that's fair to say?
That's a good label, yeah, eco-socialist.
That's a good label. Can you describe a little bit, just for the viewers and for listeners who don't know completely what you're all about, can you describe a little bit about what your political philosophy entails?
Well, eco-socialism is a socialism for the 21st century. Traditional socialism believed in social ownership and democratic administration of the major means of production and distribution, for economic justice, and for economic democracy as part of a foundation for real political democracy. But in the 19th and 20th century, scarcity was the problem. Increasing production was the big issue. And socialism said it could do it better than capitalism. Capitalism was pretty good at it. I think the economic justice and economic democracy arguments were stronger. In any case, now we are so damn productive, that's our problem. I heard a figure today, the weight of what we have produced is more than the weight of all of life on Earth. I mean, we're just producing stuff and the planet can't sustain it. So eco-socialism means production for need, people's basic needs, within ecological limits. And that's a key issue now, given that we're blowing past planetary boundaries, not just temperature and the climate, but the nitrogen phosphorus cycle and what that does to the oceans. And related to release of carbon is ocean acidification and what that does to ocean ecosystems. I mean, there are like 9 or 10 of these boundaries that we've blasted past that are basically putting our future in jeopardy. Right. So that's why it's so urgent. And that's why we put the ecological in front of socialism.
Right. And so with kind of access to the internet becoming more prevalent day by day, we're kind of seeing the growth of more, not fringe as much as just farther out ideologies. We're seeing ideologies like libertarianism all the way to hardcore communism becoming more popular, especially among youth. Do you think that this is more of a positive thing or a negative thing for youth to be more involved in more third party and more unique political ideologies?
Well, I think it's a good thing. Youth have always driven social change. And in most cases, that's been positive and progressive. Now, the problem with the internet, in the absence of civic organization, where people actually meet face to face and challenge each other's ideas. People can get in their silos on the internet and start detaching themselves from reality. I mean, we see that on the right with the QAnon stuff and the election stuff and the COVID is a hoax and climate is a hoax. You see it on the left. You've got these little quote unquote communist groups that are denying what's happened to the Uyghurs in China, or to the Hong Kongers, or to people in North Korea or Syria. And they have this, what we call campist view that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if you're against US imperialism, you got to be for any damn dictator that's fighting the US, which to me is not what a socialist position certainly should be. In fact, you can't convince people that socialism is a good idea if you're saying North Korea or Syria is a model of it. So I think, there's a lot of stuff on the internet that in the absence of other ways where people get checked on their beliefs, and have to test out their ideas, it can become a problem because of these, self-reflecting bubbles.
So on that, you talk about American imperialism. I want to talk about your stance on Iran, which would be considered by many a terrorist regime. Joe Biden would like to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal in his presidency. What would your stance be on Iran if you were in a position of power?
Well, the nuclear deal will prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons. And we got to deal with some really bad actors who have nuclear weapons in order to, we're now not only worried about proliferation to countries like Iran, we're in the middle of a nuclear arms race. The US is modernizing its forces, new strategic nukes, new tactical nukes. Russia has followed suit. China has followed suit. We're off to the races. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist says they moved their doomsday clock the closest they've ever had it to midnight. So yeah, you got to deal with some bad regimes. But I think the goal of preventing Iran from having a nuclear weapon is a good one. That doesn't mean you have to approve everything Iran does.
And further, of course, I'd like to pose the question of imposing sanctions upon Iran. Joe Biden would like to lift the sanctions that Trump has placed on Iran. Would you lift sanctions on Iran or continue having sanctions on Iran for the next 4 years should you be president?
Yeah, I would lift them. I think the way to promote human rights actually and democracy is cultural and economic intercourse. That was Tom Paine's idea, way back. And you can't bring democracy at the end of a barrel of a gun, but if it becomes an idea whose time has come in a community or a society, it's pretty hard to stop. So I think that now the United States, to be effective, has to clean up its own act with respect to human rights and democracy. And we're not the greatest example. We're a democracy where the two governing parties administer their own elections. The Green Party just went through court cases where you had partisan hacks on both sides and in the boards of election. Democrats voted to knock us off. Republicans voted to keep us on. The facts and the law were irrelevant. This was pure political hacks. And, that's not a good model for democracy. It's something we need to learn from other countries, most of which have independent electoral administration. Ballot access. That's just another thing. It's really hard to get on the ballot in this country compared to a lot of other countries. So, I think, you want to promote human rights, first thing you got to do is exercise them at home. So you set a good example.
You
Right.
talked about being knocked off ballots and ballot access. In 2016, you were denied ballot access in Pennsylvania, which became a key state in determining the results of the election. How crucial was losing Pennsylvania as a state for the Green Party?
Well, it wasn't the end of the world. The Pennsylvania Greens will be able to come back in the next election. And they may have done it down ballot in this election, got enough votes so that they have a ballot access status. I'm not exactly sure where they stand on that. I was talking with one of them, but there are 51 different jurisdictions. It's hard to keep them all straight. But I think, the people that it hurt more than the Green Party were the voters of Pennsylvania. They didn't have all their choices on the ballot. And if they are people that are, say, oppose fracking, which a plurality of people in Pennsylvania do, they had no presidential ticket on the ballot to vote for. They had to write us in. We did get write-in. No, actually, yeah, we did get write-in status there. And the grounds for knocking us off in Pennsylvania were that the stand-in candidate on the petition didn't attach their resignation so our vice president's candidate could take her place to the petition. She, what did she do? She scanned it and emailed it into the Board of Election, which couldn't find it for 3 weeks. That's so technical and minor, and the information the Board of Election needed they had, yet they used that to knock us off the ballot. And it wasn't because the law said so, it's because the Democrats had a majority on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and they were the last court to look at it.
Right. So we see with we're talking about a little bit about voter suppression, a little bit of that two-party thing where no other parties can really get in on the election and things like that, we're seeing the Democratic Party kind of move left a lot. And there are a lot of people who are voting for the Democratic Party are voting for Bernie, right? Bernie has always been a popular independent, and a lot of people wanted him to run for that Democratic seat so that he could have a higher chance of winning the presidency. Do you ever see yourself running for the Democratic presidential seat?
No, I think Bernie shows us why. Bernie won 14 elections as an independent, to mayor of Burlington several times, to Congress several times, to the US Senate twice. And then he goes into the Democratic primary, and both times the establishment closed ranks to defeat him. So what Bernie does is my late friend Bruce Dixon called him a sheepdog. He herds progressives into the Democratic Party where they're captured because, look at the Biden administration. He's stuffing his administration with deficit hawks and war hawks. And the progressives, they got no leverage. Because once they close ranks, the establishment to defeat Sanders and the progressives silenced themselves. They made no demands on Biden. The Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force document was all Biden. But it had the signatures of people like AOC and Bernie Sanders. So that tells me, they basically made the Democrats look better than they are, and they're not getting anything that they've been fighting for. I think we're better off taking our program directly to the people. Now, in a presidential race, it's really tough for us because the larger dynamic determines, how we're going to be treated. We're like a cork on the ocean. We can win local races. We've won over 1,200 over the years. We have over 100 local elected officials. And what we've got to do is expand that into the thousands. And from that foundation, get in state legislatures and the House of Representatives. When we do that, and we got a caucus in the House, then we run a presidential ticket. It'll be hard not to take seriously.
Right. And so with the Democratic and the Republican kind of two parties butting heads, and there's no room for really anybody else to get in there. A lot of people say that you shouldn't vote for third parties because it's taking away votes from the bigger team that they want to support. We see that with the Green Party. A lot of people say you shouldn't vote for the Green Party because you're taking votes away from the Democrats. And a lot of people say you shouldn't vote for the Libertarians because they're stealing votes from the Republicans. How do you respond to these criticisms?
Well, first of all, most of our voters wouldn't vote if we weren't on the ballot. We didn't get an exit poll on this question this election, but in 2016, the exit poll showed that 61% of our presidential candidates' voters, Jill Stein's voters, would not have come out to vote if she wasn't on the ballot. So we're not stealing votes. We're bringing new voters to the polls. Second of all, what's wrong with stealing votes? I mean, every politician's out there trying to get all the votes they can. Why are we stealing? Why aren't the Democrats stealing votes from us? So, there's a real kind of bias in that point of view. And the third thing is, our platform was more popular than both Biden and Trump. Green New Deal, over 60% want that. Fox News did an exit poll on what they call government-run health insurance. 72% of the people want it. That's Medicare for all. Fox News, I think, was surprised at the result because of the way they called it. A ban on fracking. That's a majority position in the country. Medicare for all. Well, I just did that one. What's the other one? Oh, the Koch, one of their organizations had YouGov do a poll. Do you want to cut the military budget and put that money into domestic needs? 75% of the people. So, it's just an irony for us that what we were talking about was the most popular program. Biden and Trump were opposed to all those things. Yet, we were basically blanked out of the media, not in the debates. And the progressive intelligentsia, our so-called radical intellectuals, they spent a lot more energy attacking us than they did raising their own progressive program and asking Biden to adopt it, which I think is why now Biden feels he owes the progressive left nothing because they made no demands. They never threatened to take their votes elsewhere. And, if he can take your votes for granted, he doesn't have to pay attention to you.
Right. Do you think Biden will be able to properly represent a lot of the more leftist people that are in the Democratic Party? Do you think he'll be able to properly represent their ideals and continue that in these next 4 to 8 years?
He has no intention to. He's against Medicare for all. He boasted about that. He defeated, quote unquote, the socialists in the race. His climate policy it's a climate disaster. It's pro-fossil fuels, pro-fracking, pro-nuclear. I mean, that has been a economically unsuccessful industry aside from the dangers and the permanent waste that it produces, and a diversion of money that could be put into renewable energy sources. And the amount of money he's proposed to spend on clean energy, I think in practice is going to mean the addition of some wind and solar electric power on top of more power fired by gas-fired power plants, with all the pipelines and fracking that will probably get approved. And then Kerry, that think tank he came from, World War Zero, when he was appointed as the climate envoy on the National Security Council, they said, great, here's what we need. We need more detention camps because there'll be more climate refugees. So it's kind of a Fortress America, Fortress Europe approach to this problem. Military spending to deal with the South China Sea and the oil gas there, and the Arctic Ocean, where Russia has released the first of 7 planned barges with 2 nuclear power plants on them to power oil and gas drilling. And our response is military, according to this think tank that Kerry came from. I think that's scary as hell. There's nothing that the progressives in any of that have been demanding.
So I want to ask about Biden again, because this week he announced his cabinet picks. And I think just yesterday he gave Susan Rice and Dennis McDonough lead roles in an administration. Do any of these cabinet picks make you hopeful of the Biden administration, or do they just further this belief that you already had about his presidency?
Yeah, they confirmed. I think, Neera Tanden in particular, as I tweeted, and it got quoted in the Washington Times, that was a big FU to the progressives. Because she was, very nasty toward the Sanders people. And when she had the time, she went after us too. So I don't see any, there are a couple progressive economists, like Jared Bernstein, but he was in the Obama administration working for Biden, and, he probably gave his advice, but it wasn't taken. And so I think, the center of gravity in the Biden administration is very pro-corporate and strongly military.
So on important issues like military and climate change that Biden just opposes your views completely on, do you believe it's possible to prevent or at the very least slow down climate change within our current capitalist state?
There are lots of measures that could be taken. Some will, joining the Paris Climate Accord or rejoining, even though the commitments are inadequate to the kind of scaling down of carbon release we got to do in short order. So, I don't put any hope in the Biden administration. I hope the climate movement, gets very militant in opposing the expansion of fracking and pipelines to bring the gas to market and to refineries, and the tar sands oil to refineries. I think that's the cutting edge issue. And then we've got to work to get local governments and state governments to adopt their own versions of the Green New Deal, which, given they don't have the financial resources the federal government can have, because they all got to run on balanced budgets. So they're limited in the amount they can invest in this transition. But by, it's the old, what Brandeis called the laboratories of democracy. A lot of times we get change at the federal level after it's been, done a lot at the local and state level. So that's where I'm, going to put my emphasis on in the next period. I have very little faith that whatever token progressives are in the, vast Biden administration, they're not going to have influence. The center of gravity is going to be, the corporate Democrats. It's the Clinton Obama types that are coming back again.
One thing that we noticed was that in the 2020 election, the Green Party received a lot smaller percent of votes than it did in 2016. Why do you think voters were maybe a little bit less inclined to vote Green Party this year? And did you expect an increase or decrease in the votes?
Expected a decrease. The dynamic this time was anybody but Trump on the whole progressive side of politics. So we were really up against it. We knew that from the start. 2016 was a very different dynamic. It was an open seat with the two most unpopular major party candidates in history. Donald Trump #1 and Hillary Clinton #2. So the third party vote was big. For us, for the libertarians, for Evan McMullin, the guy from Utah that was kind of the never Trump Republican that got in late. We all did better. So that's what I mean. We're kind of a cork on the sea to this larger dynamic until the Green Party gets a stronger institutional base in local, state, and in the House governments. And then, basically it'd be hard to ignore us. And then right now, our candidates, our message, our execution of a campaign plan, we knock ourselves out, but the larger dynamic so much defines what the result's going to be. And I've seen that in New York. I get a lot of credit for getting the ballot line back in 2010 after we failed 2 times. But you look back, the first time it was would have been the first Black governor. So all the liberals voted for the Democrat. And we got more than the votes we needed to get a ballot line if they counted them for down ballot races, but not for governor. So that was the dynamic there. The next time it was the sheriff of Wall Street, Eliot Spitzer, the big liberal, again, a tough race for a Green. I got to run against Andrew Cuomo, who was very pro-austerity. And I got a lot of, public employee votes, enough to get the ballot line the first time. And then, as you mentioned, in 2014, he got them more angry and I got 5% of the vote.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that larger dynamic, really defines what we can do until we get a stronger foothold in the political system by electing local people.
Right.
So you talk about the importance of the down ballot elections, the state and local elections for the Green Party. How do you see the Green Party and your future in the Green Party in the next 4 years? Are you planning on running for re-election, running in New York?
I'm not planning to run again anywhere, but I've run for office a lot of times, actually 25 times. Only 2 times did I take the initiative, and one of those times the Greens didn't let me do it. So every other one I got drafted for. And so we'll see what the future brings. What I want to focus on, and we've filed again our campaign committee for the next election cycle, but we're going to focus on helping local Green parties get better organized, local candidates run better campaigns, continue to speak out on the issues, issue statements, that kind of thing, try to do popular education around eco-socialist principles and policies, and do that kind of thing. Be organizers and activists and see where we are in 2 years. In New York, where I live, we now have, because of a law that passed by the Democrats under the cover of the COVID pandemic, attached to the state budget last April, we now have about the hardest ballot access requirements in the country. So, I may be doing a lot around that in the 2022 election, where not only is the governor's office up and the other statewide offices, Chuck Schumer's seat is up. And we got some issues with Schumer, from, his Wall Street oriented economic policies to his very aggressive foreign policies.
Right. So with the future, we're talking a little bit about the future in the Green Party. Do you think the Democratic Party would ever be able to shift fully into a more socialist, more progressive kind of area? Or do you think there will need to be a third party rise like the Green Party in order to kind of instate that full on transition?
Yeah, I think AOC once said, if we were any other country, Joe Biden and her would not be in the same party, because most parties have most countries have proportional representation. And so, for her kind of democratic socialism, or at least New Deal liberalism, which I think is really closer to what, she and Bernie Sanders are campaigning on, that's not compatible with the corporate centrism, social liberalism, but fiscal conservatism of the corporate Democrats. It's really a different politics. It's the difference between, the left parties in Europe and the center-right parties like the Christian Democrats. It's more like what the Democratic Party corporate Democrats are. So I think the party that's waiting to be born is on the left of those who have been disgusted with the two parties trying to build a third party, and progressives in the Democratic Party who, the Green Party is mostly filled with really pissed off former Democrats. They finally realized the Democrats were not going to stop the war in Iraq or fight for affordable housing or fight fracking or really do a Green New Deal. And so they come to the Greens. Right. So I think that's where, the third party is going to come from.
So is there a Democratic senator or congressman that you believe can further Green Party ideals?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders, we agree on Medicare for all. His Green New Deal plan of all the Democrats was really serious. It was not as fast or as fully funded as ours. We relied more on public enterprise and planning to make a more rapid transition, but his was a serious proposal. The others weren't, in our evaluation. So yeah, Sanders, people like AOC on certain issues. But on the other hand, both of them do a lot. They go along to try to get along with the corporate Democrats. So during the campaign, Bernie Sanders was saying he'll settle for Medicare for all 60 and up. I mean, that's a signature issue. And one of the strongest arguments for single payer, Medicare for all, is that it's a single payer, which is efficient. And if you just do 60 and up, you lose that efficiency, which is one of the strongest arguments for Medicare for all. Didn't make any sense. And then, AOC will, make some statements, but then come around and, like I just know here in New York, as soon as the primary was over in 2018, she immediately endorsed, Andrew Cuomo. Even though, I was the Green candidate, my politics and her stated politics are much closer. So the other problem for us is, getting a hearing from these people. So while we watch them and kind of like some of the things they do, they won't give us the time of day, frankly. It's not just, little people like me. Ralph Nader will tell you that Bernie Sanders this whole time in Washington has never taken a meeting with Ralph Nader, who has a, record of effective reform and, going back decades to the 60s. And it just, Ralph's problem was he ran against them. So they don't want, from 96 on. So he's a pariah to those people. So they don't want to really meet with the progressive grassroots that aren't with them blindly in electoral politics.
So we wanted to touch a little bit on your ideas with the minimum wage increase. Of course, another big argument with the Democrats is raising the minimum wage to $15. Do you support raising the minimum wage up to $15? Do you think it should be raised more than that? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I've been for 15 for a long time. In fact, we raised it to 20 for this campaign because we figured that to support a family of 3 above the poverty line, you need $20 an hour to be self-reliant. And this society is so much more productive. There are different ways to look at it. If you take the 1968 minimum wage and just adjust for inflation, you get to about $15 an hour. You adjust for the increases in productivity and the actual value we now create, it'd be in the mid-20s. So $15 or $20 an hour seemed like a good floor. And if we couldn't get that, the job guarantee we talk about would pay that, $20 an hour. And that would create an effective floor, because then the private sector would have to compete with those public jobs and their wages.
So I want to ask you about, COVID-19, since we're all living through the pandemic. You've been very critical of the president's response. And I'd like to ask, how would you have handled things differently should you have been president during, the peak of the pandemic in March or April?
Well, I'd have listened to the public health advice, the epidemiologists. They know how to do this. And would have involved ramping up testing, contact tracing, and quarantining those infected or exposed. Like the Major League Sports are doing. That's what we needed to do for the whole society. That would have suppressed community spread and enabled us to go back to work and to school safely. Instead, Trump just said, do whatever you want. It's up to the states. I'm out of here. I'm not a shipping clerk, he said at one point. He didn't even want to deal with it. I think he just got tired of the whole thing, and he got mad at it because it was killing people and it was undermining his credibility as a president. So here we are, into the Trump administration. We're having, a 9/11's worth of deaths every day now. We're approaching, what is it, 200,000 deaths? And I heard one of those epidemiologists on TV today saying we can expect about 3,000 deaths a day for the next 2 or 3 months. I mean, this is just, so, that's what needed to be done. The other thing is, since we didn't have the testing, contact tracing, and quarantining program scaled up, we had to lock down. And that hurt a lot of people, lost jobs, businesses, people lost their health care, got behind on the rent and mortgage. So there needed to be COVID relief. And the CARES Act was, pretty good there right at the beginning, but nothing since. And so people are really hurting, and they're facing, evictions. More businesses are going out because we just shut down again in this current situation in a lot of states. So you needed that economic relief as well, to keep people going until the economy could reopen. So I advocated, there was a great bill that Ilhan Omar had. It was called, cancel rent and mortgage. What it really meant was the federal government would pay that, so that your community banks and your credit unions and, your mom and pop landlords, who depended on those payments weren't hurt. And then they would pay all the small businesses and self-employed tradespeople that, manage and service the property. And so all those businesses would have kept going for the emergency. I thought that was a great program. And then if you wanted to sell private rental housing, your local public housing authorities would have the first option to buy, which would have expanded the, public housing provided at cost. So that's a great bill. It got nowhere. Democratic House, Pelosi didn't want to touch it. So, there are practical solutions. If I was president, I'd have been telling Nancy Pelosi, this is what I want. If I was president, she probably wouldn't be the Speaker of the House, because there'd probably be a change in the House as well.
Another issue that Trump has been heavily criticized on, besides his managing of the pandemic, is criminal justice reform. We saw riots and protests throughout March and April. If you were president, what criminal justice reform would we see?
Well, I wrote a long policy paper even before, George Floyd got murdered, calling for community control of the police and outlining what the Justice Department and the federal government could do to encourage that, because these are local jurisdictions that govern the police. But for me, the bottom line problem is the police themselves. So if there are assaults or murders, they cover them up. There needs to be an independent investigation and sanctioning of misconduct. so that's where community control comes in. You have police commissions that are publicly elected or even selected by lot, like juries, who can hire and fire department leadership, review and rid departments of racists and sadists, oversee policies and budgets, and then investigate and discipline misconduct. All we're getting now from the Democrats are use of force reforms. You know, you can't use chokeholds. The problem is, if the police are still policing themselves, you know, somebody will use a chokehold and they'll get away with it. Like Eric Garner, that Padalino guy that choked Eric Garner to death. The chokehold was banned in New York for 20 years when Eric Garner was strangled. And Padalino was not disciplined by his department. So that's the problem, you know, as far as I see. And I'm disappointed that those demonstrations seem to have settled on pushing their local departments or local governments around use of force and maybe a little more power or access to information for these review boards. But I don't want a review board. I want a board that actually governs the police, that's independent of the police. That's a radical change. And so that's what we've been emphasizing. And, you know, this stuff's been going on in my memory since the Watts riots in 1965 in California. And it's going to be a cycle like this until we change the relationship between the police and the community, the power relationship.
So a lot of people who can get behind, you know, these sorts of policies and reform feel that the rhetoric coming from these movements, like phrases like ACAB, all cops are bastards, are too decisive. Obama said a couple weeks ago, when you say ACAB, you lose people. Do you feel that in recent years, left-wing movements have lost people due to really decisive rhetoric when their policies could have been more appealing, were appealing, but their rhetoric lost people?
Yeah, it's more than recent years. I remember when SDS blew apart and Weatherman had a slogan for a while called "Fight the People." I mean, come on. And next thing you know, they're all Democrats. You know, some of them were calling me, telling me, you got to tell people to vote for Biden. And, you know, 40 years ago, they had a slogan called "Fight the People." I think a lot of this is from people that don't actually live in the communities affected by police brutality. You know, I live in a community here where the teenage shootings are among the highest in the country. And, you know, the community wants the police to get the shooters, you know, solve the crimes. And the complaint is they come in and harass people for non-criminal behavior and low-level offenses, but when there's a serious crime, they're not around or they don't do a good job. So the crimes don't get solved. So people don't want no police, they want good police. They want police that serve them. And, you know, in this city in particular, it's a problem. We got half the city's people of color, 90% of the cops are white. City's been under federal consent decree since 1980 to get a force that reflects the demographics of the city. We're 40 years later, it hasn't happened. People get frustrated. But to say abolish the police, defund the police, you know, maybe, you know, we need more money. Police shouldn't be doing some things. You know, if you're homeless, you shouldn't send the police to give a vagrancy charge. Why don't we find a homeless person a home? Drug addicts, they don't need jail, they need drug treatment, and so forth. That's the thinking behind the defund the police slogan, which really means, in the Black Lives Matter movement, called it divest, reinvest. That slogan, defund the police, kind of came out of this recent round of protests. And it wasn't focus group checked. That's for sure. I think Obama got that right. So, you know, my attitude is I get where you're going with it, and we do need to get more money into these communities for real social services. But defund the police, I mean, I know in this community I'm in, people don't want that. They just want some police that actually do their job.
Right. So that's all our questions for today. Thank you again, Mr. Hawkins, for coming on.
Hey, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thank thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to continue to support us, you can do so by checking out our Instagram pages at YIP Institute and at WatchVerbum. You can also look at our website at www.yipinstitute.com. Make sure to follow our page as we upload weekly. Have a good day.